what is seen as a divide, which, and ironically, there's no divide if we look at the fact that it's a human person at the beginning and the end, we understand more fully what the church is talking about when she says Catholic social teaching. I'll come down from that soapbox because it may have opened a can of worms, but I do want you to understand that it is Catholic social teaching. Social justice is part of Catholic social teaching. Moving on. Chapter 3 will talk about man's activity in the universe, and it says, and I put in there in your notes, a very specific, talking about human activity proceeds from man and is ordered to him. So anything that is actual human activity is from man and ordered towards his good. And then the church will go on to talk about autonomy of earthly affairs. And what she means by that is that there is a certain order, and this is what I was talking about just a moment ago. The church's mission is salvation of souls. It's not to set up a government that will run your country. So there's a certain freedom to the earthly affairs. However, and she does make this also very clear, the moment we use this phrase to separate the created order from the Creator, the idea becomes repugnant to any sensible person because that lends itself to thinking, I'll do whatever I dang well please. So while the church is not going to specifically insert itself into a political debate or a political fight, as you know, like a Catholic priest can't become an elected official, she does recognize that when the moral order or the social order separates itself from God, we've entered into a very dire situation, and that is when the church does step in and say, hey, wait, why are you as a country, for instance, or why are you as a people choosing to separate yourselves from the Creator? So she wants to help order things towards the goodness of our salvation, whilst at the same time respecting the whole plan of creation that God gives us the freedom, the intellect, and the will to order that which is around us towards our salvation and towards the good of our brothers and sisters. And so this autonomy is always kept in check, again, by you, the good lay faithful, being part of the world, being involved in worldly affairs and helping to order the world towards its Creator. Chapter 4 goes on to talk about the role of the church in the modern world, promoting particularly an authentic humanism. In number 41, it talks about what the church offers to individuals. And I want to point out a specific part of this. I think you have the full quote there, but it says, the church knows well that God alone, whom it serves, can satisfy the deepest cravings of the human heart. For the world and all it has to offer can never fully content it. So the church understands, and we all understand, that the world's not going to save us. I said this a few weeks ago in a homily. It's not going to be a president of this country that's going to get me to heaven. It's Christ and Him crucified. And the church realized that. That's her mission, to preach Christ and Him crucified, to get us to heaven. And so she says, kind of the culmination of part 1 in chapter 4 is that Christ is the Alpha and Omega. He is the one whom we preach. It is the salvation in Christ which she is always about. And so the church defines clearly she's not an international entity that's seeking to infiltrate your economic and social structures. She's giving guidelines rooted in the human person of what she thinks would be good for those economic and social structures in the world. Is that clear? I'm saying yes and no. So, yeah, I'm getting some yes, some no. So, the church is stating that she's not going to get involved with being a political, like there's no Catholic party per se. There's no country that's going to say, we're Catholic, by gosh, and all you're going to get the heck out of here. That fundamentally the church is saying would reject the dignity of the human person to use their freedom to choose religion. But what the church is saying to the world is, here are some good tips to help prevent you from destroying yourselves. Giving us the, saying respect for the human person fundamentally is how a society should order itself. So that no government or corporation will ever set itself up to be inherently against the human person. Seems kind of basic, but think of how many corporations and how many governments are fundamentally anti-person.
My question centers on what does the church think of taking from those who have to give to those who don't? From the government. I mean, not.
We're going to talk about subsidiarity and solidarity in a few moments, and I think that's going to be the way that we can answer that question. So if you'll let me get there, I'll get there. That's okay. No, it's all right. It's somewhat of a political question, and so I'm not here to talk about politics. I'll tell you what the church says. And that's what you want to know. So I'll get to that. But we understand that the church is not here to be, the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. The church is here to save souls. But she wants to advise the world because she considers herself, and rightfully so, an expert in humanity. She knows people better than anybody could. I mean, think of all the information a priest gets on a human person after a couple weeks of confession. You learn things. But we've looked at 2,000 years of our intellectual and theological history to learn better who we are. And so the church is trying to offer to the world some guidance on how to steer itself. In part 2, and this is a pretty short kind of portion because I think largely these were specific problems that continue to be resonating in our society, and I'll talk about them in a kind of general way, but there are so many different things that have been written since this by our popes, by our magisterium, that are, in my opinion, clearer. So it's worth reading the foundations here, but I get the suggested reading list I give you at the end talks about a lot of the second part in greater detail. So part 2 is going to talk about some specific problems facing the modern world. And what does she first address? What does the church first address? The dignity of marriage and family. She recognizes, and beautifully so, that the fundamental cell of all society is the human family. So married life should flourish, right? In this new age of globalization and partnerships, we've got friends. I can meet my wife on the internet from 5,000 miles away. We don't have to speak the same language because we can use body language to tell each other how we feel about each other. No, that's terrible. There's a lot of miscommunication that occurs with body language. We all know that. A lot of miscommunication occurs with with verbal communication too. But the idea that because we've become more enlightened, we've become more global, that we know, I've traveled the world, now I know myself better, these ideas. The church is saying, well, that's great, but look at the problems that have come about. Not to say these problems didn't exist, but let's face the facts. In the past 50 years, and I'll point to 1931 again, to the Lambeth Conference, look at what's happened to marriage. It's overshadowed by, and I quote, polygamy, the plague of divorce, so-called free love, and similar blemishes. Furthermore, married love is too often dishonored by selfishness, hedonism, and unlawful contraceptive practices. Besides, the economic, social, psychological, and civil climate of today has a severely disturbing effect on family life. This is 1965. So some of you were alive then. And some of you know that that was the case then as it is now. To say that things have changed and gotten better, no. Our divorce rates are higher. Our rates of, I don't want to get into all the nitty-gritty details. You can go to Theology on Tap, got this hit over the head. But men in general have really dropped the ball. Men, I specifically mean as a gender, have run away from their traditional role as fathers. Men have specifically run away from their responsibilities to their spouses. And it's not to say women haven't, because a lot of women have too. At the same time, you've got the uber-feminism movement clashing with all of this. It's not an authentic feminism. It's a feminism that makes women men, and that's not being a real woman. So you've got these ideologies that are just butting heads with one another, and so the family life is starting to really suffer because of all this. But the church just lightly insists upon a few key concepts. One, that God himself is the author of marriage. Marriage is not created by man. If you need any further evidence, I would just recommend you read Matthew's Gospel or Genesis, either one, good sources. But it says, and I'll quote briefly, God himself is the author of marriage and has endowed it with various benefits and with various ends in view. It goes on to talk about those various ends and benefits. Conjugal love, the sharing of union with one another as spouses in a conjugal way, in an emotional, spiritual, intellectual way also. The church talks about what married love itself is, how specifically it is of a great act of great dignity. You become co-creators with God himself of a new human life. There's nothing more glorifying than that in this side of heaven. You get to do one thing really awesome that God is intimately involved in. That think about the fact that you get to be part of God's plan for salvation. And so it holds the dignity of conjugal love up very highly. It talks about the fruitfulness of marriage. It talks about having children, offspring. This is where some people will point to and say the church is attacking couples and saying that conjugal life is valued above the couple. That's not in these documents. It talks specifically about the good of union, and it talks about it for spouses, and it also talks about the good of procreation, that these two goods can be held in compatibility with one another, and so that they're not attacking one another. The good of spouses, the good of procreation are always part of the conjugal act. It'll go on to talk about married love and respect for human life, and I do mean this. If you want to read more about it, read Humanae Vitae. It's a direct result of this paragraph, which is paragraph 51 in Guadium et Spes, is Humanae Vitae, which came out 3 years later. And finally, it talks about fostering marriage in the family, the duty for all families as Christians. And this goes over some of the kind of things that you'll see later in Familiaris Consortio that we talk about frequently in our catechesis here at the whole community catechesis, is that the family is responsible for raising their children in the faith. It's a domestic church. And what does that look like? What does that mean? It means that we take responsibility not only for our spouses and their salvation, but for the salvation of the souls of our children, that we cannot neglect our fundamental responsibility as parents, as humans, as co-Christians with one another, to try to get each other to heaven. And so the church just kind of stresses that a lot. Chapter 2 on the proper development of culture. I'm not going to give you details. Frankly, this is a chapter that largely does not get read by anybody, because the proper development, I mean, just being very honest, the proper development of culture, that was put in there because of a few cardinals, essentially, who wanted to talk about the fundamental relationship of culture in the church. That's important. And that's what the new evangelization largely is talking about, is this whole dynamic of the culture of Catholicism and what is authentic culture within the secular world. And that's a great topic, but the subject does not get addressed very specifically in here. And so I chose to kind of ignore it so I could go on to the next topic, which is economic and social life. And this is where, again, I hope to address maybe your question a little more specifically. Economic and social life continues to be a big concern for Catholics today. And I do, as this is preaching, this is not teaching, this is a preaching moment. Ultimately, we need to be concerned most about our salvation. We do need to help order this world in the best way we can, and a means that is just and fair and seeks the good of every person. But we can't spend every waking hour reading political conversations or watching news or beating ourselves up about the last election. It's not worth it. I love you guys. It's not worth it. Spend 10 minutes a day praying instead of watching Fox News or CNN. Just try that for the next 22 days. Try it, and I'm not kidding, the next 22 days. Or better yet, and I don't mean this by anybody specific, but I mean it, don't check your email when you wake up. Wait an hour. Pray. Spend some time with Scripture. Run. Do something to get outside of the box and the world that comes with it, because our destiny is not for this world. It's for heaven. We're citizens of heaven. That being said, I'll talk about what the church discussed on economic and social life briefly, because I don't think, there's not a lot here. You need, as I encourage, and I will try to in the coming year of faith, I am going to try to teach some classes on the social teaching of the church, because I think it's very important for us to understand what the church actually says. Not what we think the church says, but what does the church really say? And so the first thing it says, and this is a great quote, man is the source, the focus, and the end of all economic and social life. That man is, not means, not production, not capital, man is fundamentally at the center of every social and economic interaction. Pope John Paul II, in his great encyclical Laborans Exercens, continues to underline the importance of man as being the center of all social and economic work. That every labor we do, we must look at the human person, not its results. That's important to understand the efficacy of his actions, but to look first at the human person, to look at the conditions in which the human person is laboring in. I concern myself with this. I think about it sometimes. I really want to know where my Keurig coffee comes from. I've looked it up. From what I can tell, there's some good places Not all of them are good people, though, and so I'm trying to not buy their coffee, right? These are decisions we have to think about as Catholics. How are the people who are making the products I use being treated in their work environment? Because man is the source of economic and social life. The disparity of wealth and poverty is exacerbated in the modern mentality. And this focus on the self brings about a disregard for the foundation of economics, which is the human person. So this disparity of wealth and poverty has increased. And in light of that, many of us, including myself at times, have been enraged by the excess of wealth, have been enraged by the fact that people enjoy more than what I think they deserve. And at the same time, I'm enraged at what the poor are suffering. Well, good for me. I got enraged. Did I do a DAMN thing about it? That's really what social justice is about. I told you that 20 minutes ago, and I'll reiterate it. I can get frustrated. I can say, that country is not doing the right thing, and that country's not doing the right thing. And yeah, have those dialogues. Dialogues, that's what they are. They're not arguments, they're dialogues with your friends about the good that you see or the bad that you see. But do something about it yourself, too. That's ultimately what we're all called to do. If we want to bring justice and peace into this world, it starts with me. And it starts with my relationship with Christ, and so I can understand better what He means when He says, go and do good to your neighbor. Move on to this quote here, economic development in the service of man. We must encourage technical progress in the spirit of enterprise because we foster the eagerness for creativity and improvement. And we must promote adaptation of the production methods and all serious efforts of people engaged in production. In other words, of all the elements which contribute to economic progress. But the ultimate and basic purpose of economic production does not consist merely in the increase of goods produced, nor in profit, nor prestige. It is directed to the service of man. That is, in his totality, taking into account his material needs and the requirements of his intellectual, moral, spiritual, and religious life. And therefore, economic activity is to be carried out in accordance with techniques and methods belonging to the moral order. Our economic decisions have a moral element to them. That's what the church is saying at this point, that we have to think about the morality of our economic decisions. And so this means we must consider how our purchases affect those around us. Does it improve those around us? Does it destroy the quality of life for people? If I'm buying, I may upset somebody here, but if I'm buying a V8 truck and I live in a concrete city and I never go to the woods, why do I have a V8 truck? It doesn't make any sense. At the same time, is it responsible for me as a mother of 5 and my husband makes $60,000 to buy a Chevy Volt because I want to be economically, or I want to be socially aware of the environment? No, it's not. You need a bigger vehicle, and you need something that gets good gas mileage and is reliable and is not going to blow up. But you have to keep all those things in mind. I mean, really, my sister who has 6 kids, they drive a 15-passenger van because they've got 8 people in a car, and a lot of those people are little, so they've got toys and blankets and all that stuff. Is a 15-passenger van extremely economical? No. But do I think they should, downsize, buy 2 other cars that are smaller and may get better gas mileage? No, that's not good either. Because what happens? Then the family's separated. They're in 2 different cars, no longer together. So what's the good there? What's the higher good? What's the unity of the family, right? And so we have to think about our economic decisions, ultimately always founded in the human person. So the church will go on to speak of work, working conditions, and leisure. And I'll speak very specifically to this point. She promotes that work is good and human beings should work. Something in Scripture about earning your wage, I think. Working conditions, that they be basically not harmful to the human person. So if you work in a factory, if there are constant threats of danger around you, that's not really a good place to work. Now, does it mean you should quit your job and just live on welfare or live on assisted living for the next 12 months? No. It means you should talk to your boss about the fact that your working conditions are terrible. And if he says, talk to your union rep, go talk to your union rep. Don't just throw up your hands and say, no, it's not worth it. Do something about it. Be motivated to bring, a good working condition to you and your fellow workers. She talks about just wage and leisure, that we deserve a just wage for what we do, for what our work is. And that ultimately, also, man needs to have time for leisure, that he can't just be a cog in the machine constantly, 52 hours of work a week, or 52 hours of work a year. She'll talk about unions and strikes. She does say that unions are okay. However, strikes, very, very rare. She talks about it. She says strikes generally are not going to be good because it's denying people of goods that they need. It's kind of confounding the whole process of production. And there's jobs that depend on it. There's people who are now, you're not producing still, and now that train car driver is not going to have his train to drive. That mother of four that works in the office of the train car, she doesn't have anything to do now. So strikes have very specific conditions in which the church views them as being good. The teaching on private property as being good is part of our Catholic social teaching. It has been since we started to really talk about it in 1893 in Rerum Novarum. Private property is not evil. Amassing massive amounts of private property for the sake of owning private property, it's not good. And that needs to be called into question. Why does one person own billions of acres that there's literally thousands of people could live on, could be productive on? We have to talk about that. We have to see what's the good of him owning all these acres. And ultimately the church is not going to say an amassing of private property for the sake of private property is a good thing, but she's also going to respect the fact that we need some private property as individuals so that we can thrive and have our being. That I don't have to worry about you coming into my yard, shooting my kids, stealing my lawn chairs, that I can have my little piece of heaven. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with that. But am I using it to my good and the good of those around me? That's where it starts to become a question. And so chapter 4, the last chapter, is on political community. And I somewhat jokingly but seriously at the same time want to encourage you to read Caritas and Veritate by Pope Benedict XVI. It's the most recent magisterial teaching on the political community in the churches, basically giving some encouragement as to what would be good as she sees fit in the political community. What does he say? Well, reflecting basically back on this, it recognizes that the social order needs to be ordered towards the good of all mankind. That there can be superstructures such as a United Nations that help to promote the goodness of mankind and equality amongst nations. But it has to be infiltrated with real love for human persons. It has to be guided by a real definition of the common good. It has to be guided by a real understanding of what does subsidiarity and solidarity look like. It has to be guided by an understanding that the human person fundamentally is at the basis of all political structures. And so, he will promote in an explicit way, in Caritas and Veritate, a reordering of any structure, whether it be a capitalist democracy or different variations. Communism and socialism are explicitly rejected by the church because they are a-religious or non-religious. But structures that may look a little bit more of that nature if the human person is at the foundation and there's an understanding of God being part of that world. But largely, brothers and sisters, we don't speak on the specific actions of individuals because it's not our right. God will judge all of us. And so, questions such as yours, how does the church envision the governance of goods being distributed to people? She certainly would encourage that there be a just distribution of goods, to all people, so that they're not living in complete states of depravity. In America, and I use America as our kind of bed for this, there are the supposed 1% who make above $250,000. They comprise, 80% of all the wealth of the world, I think, is what the analogy is. So 1%, 80% of the wealth of the world. What does the church suggest the government do about that? The church suggests that the government looks at those people sternly and says, you need to think about what you're doing with all of your money. And you need to really consider, is that money being used for yourself and your own selfish gain, or can it be used for good? But it's not going to sit there and dictate to the church's. Pope Benedict is not going to call President Obama and say, hey, you need to tax those people more because they didn't earn what they received. No, the church is not that specific. She gives general guidelines that we need to look for justice and equity. We need to seek the good of every human person. So is it good that we tax people who make a bunch of money? It's good that everybody gets taxed. I believe that as an American, and I believe that as a Catholic, that we all be taxed. Should we take what is rightfully earned by somebody else and give it to somebody else? No. The church does not say that we have the right to do that. What can we do as a church? We suggest and we try to promote through the way we live our lives that those people come to recognize Christ. They come to recognize Christ as being the foundation of their decisions, so that without provocation and explicit exterior coercion, they're making the decision. People like Warren Buffett makes the decision to give his wealth away because he desires other people to benefit from it. And I'm going to finish, because it's almost time's up, by telling you just a brief story. There's two atheists in New York City who, about, I think it was 6 years ago, one atheist gave $28 million to the New York Archdiocese of New York School Fund. He's an atheist. And his buddy down the road, this is somewhere on the Upper West Side, said, oh, well, that's pretty nice. I think I'm going to do the same. And so gave more. I think gave $34 million to the Archdiocese of New York school system. And when those men were asked, they weren't identified, when they were asked why they gave the money to the Archdiocese of New York's education system, he said, because of the people they produce. He said, when you go into this city, you can find kids that came out of Catholic schools, not because they're earning more money than other people, not because of the cars they drive, but because of the kind of people they are, the good they do. That's what we as Catholics can do to change the world around us. We can't ask the government to change the world. We can pray and we can provide suggestions, and we seek justice in every situation for the human person. But ultimately, it's our responsibility as individuals and as Catholics, as a community, to show to the world through our love and our compassion and our care for the poor and the underprivileged the same opportunity maybe that they deserve, or the opportunities that they deserve. We have that responsibility. So I understand that leaves you a little bit in the dark, but I want you to think about fundamentally, why would the church specifically dictate to a government what they're going to do with their money? She gives principles, and those principles are very clearly stated, not in this document. That's why I'm not going to talk about it in relation to this document, but they're clearly stated in a few of our other social documents, and they talk about, I said it and I'll finish because I need to, subsidiarity and solidarity. That solidarity means we have a relationship to all human persons, that every human person is connected. And so we have a responsibility to those human persons. Every government, every social interaction, this is the same thing over and over again, has a responsibility to the human person. So that solidarity we experience with the poor particularly is because we as Catholics realize that Christ came to save the poor. You know, he came to save not only the poor in flesh, but the poor in spirit. And so there's a certain solidarity we show, an affection we have for the poor. It's called the fundamental option for the poor. At the same time, we have a principle of subsidiarity that looks to the local governance to be the one that dictates, that has the best means to dictate how to run a political society. And so instead of you and I relying on a national government to dictate taxes at a national level, why not look at the state? Why not look at the county and talk about taxes? That's kind of where we want to start, is looking at the most local level, because that which the local level can do should do. You know, you think of medieval ages, the local society was what governed the local society. It was only in matters of national defense and international trade and economic commerce that you really used a state or a nation. And we've run away from that in our country. I mean, we've got to face the facts. We have more, and this is not political, this is just the truth, we have more centralized government than we've ever had before. It's not anybody's fault. I'm not pointing fingers. It's just a reality. We do live in a government that's more centralized than it ever has been. And fundamentally, the Catholic Church would caution against centralizing those things which can be done on the local level.
But we all didn't do that.
What do you mean?
The vote did it. We.
Right, you as individuals. Yeah, you as individuals maybe aren't culpable. Right, but what we can do, I mean, and this is no longer on the video,
we did not, maybe as individuals, maybe we're not responsible for the person in power or the way the government is being run right now. But what we can do as active citizens of our country and responsibility, I skipped the part on participation, that we have an obligation to participate in governance, is talk about issues at the local level. So we go to town hall meetings and we say, hey, why are we doing this? We write our congressman and we say, why are we letting the government tell us how to run the county schools in Smith County, Texas? Why are we, if we can do it. Now there is the point, that's the point where we do to make the demarcation. There are some things we can't do at the local level. We can't defend our country in Smith County. We need a national, military. There's certain things like interstate commerce. A good thing. It created a bunch of roads that we all needed. There are some goods that do need to be seen in that order, but also to have the church will talk about having intermediary agencies so that the top will never be working against the bottom, and that's kind of that's where I think that's where we need to get our feet in a little bit more, is at the bottom level, so that the top does have that check. It's naturally supposed to be there. Catholic social teaching takes, I would caution you, about 3 or 4 years to really read, reread, and understand more fully. But I'm happy to talk about it, but you people need to get home. So thank you very much. I'm sorry that we didn't get through all 93 paragraphs of Guadium and Spes, but we did what we could. And I'm sure Eric will cover everything that we didn't get through next week. Thank you very much. Sorry. Oh, yes. Ms. Hannah was kind enough to bring us refreshments, so please. And others, okay, well, there's refreshments. Availability